yeah, that's who I am.
So I'm Jack Purdie. I'm also at Nottingham, Trent, and I am Student Voice Coordinator, particularly for academic representation.
Cool. And I'm Alan Roberts, and I'm at London Met Students' Union at the moment. I'm a freelancer working in student unions, and I guess I've got a policy background. That's my hat really in the world, is policy and repsy type stuff. That's me.
And hello, I can unmute now because I'm not doing boring tech stuff. I am Rosie. I'm from Organised Fun, and I'm going to be doing the clicking and hosting this chat with Alan, Rhys and Jack. So I'll do some clicking now and we can see if it works. Oh, it didn't work. That's not, is it? Let's see how to do this. I'm not very good at technology. I'm very good at talking about student opportunities, not so good at technology. So you should all be able to see now how this session works slide. So we're using Zoom webinar, which is ever so exciting because it's slightly more sophisticated than normal Zoom. Oh, someone said I am good at technology. I'm really not. Thank you. That's very nice. So how the session works. So this is a panel. As you can see, there's a few of us up here on the stage. And we're going to have a chat basically. So I'm going to talk about academic societies for a bit. But that doesn't mean that we're the only chatters. So there's a chat function where you as participants can have a conversation with each other. And I really encourage you to introduce yourselves in there and say hello, like this, say hello. And you should all see a little message from me saying say hello. Introduce yourself. Who are you? Whether you're a staff member, a student officer, a leader, a volunteer, and what's brought you to this session today. And then this is where the fancy stuff comes in. There's a Q&A. So if anybody was in the first conversation with Nadia Whitcomb, the keynote this morning, you might have used the Q&A, but for those of you that haven't, it's separate to the chat. You can ask questions in the chat as well, that's absolutely fine. But if you ask it in the Q&A, there's a fancy thing that I get to do where I can answer your questions and tell you that we've answered your questions. So please use that because that's fun. We are recording this session so that other people can watch it afterwards. So if you have anything confidential that you want to share and you don't want that to be in the recording, then just send that directly to me as a panelist or one of the other panelists. Otherwise, if you don't mind, then pop it in the Q&A or pop it in the chat. Someone has already submitted a question. Well done you. I don't know who you are because you've done it anonymously, but you get some gold star for being our first question. Well done. And everybody's introducing themselves now too, which is really cool. So that's the big thing to explain to you in terms of how the session works. We'll finish this session just before 3 o'clock. And then if you're having a really lovely time and want to carry on talking about academic societies, then I encourage you to go to the coffee shop afterwards. And the coffee shop is basically some Google Hangout rooms that we've called Table 1, Table 2 and Table 3. And in those Google Hangout rooms, you'll be able to have a chat with other people from this session. And I'll make sure at the end of the session, I tell you which table we're going to. But that involves looking at my complicated spreadsheet, which I'm not going to do now because I will get lost in complicated spreadsheets. So let's begin. Alan, Rhys and Jack have already said hi to you, and they're going to be talking to you a little bit more about stuff that they think in a minute. We have all been brought together because at separate times I've had conversations with these people about academic societies, and it's a bit of a hot topic at the moment and something that we wanted to think a bit more about. On the Organised Fun blog, I've shared a blog that Alan wrote ages ago, actually, when he got back from his Scandi trip that he'll tell you a bit more about later. But that's got some thoughts in it, and I'll share that in the chat in a minute too, so that you can have a read of that if you want to find out a bit more about the thoughts behind this session. So that's who we've got here today. And we're going to start off with Alan. So Alan, we were talking about this a while ago, and you said, oh, they do this interestingly in Scandi countries. So I wondered if you could just chat to everybody now for a few minutes about what you saw and what was interesting and what you think that means for students' unions in the UK.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Rosie. I think that in terms of what I saw, it's probably worth seeing this all as kind of a challenge. The blog I wrote was, what if tomorrow all the rules changed and you had to adapt to this situation whereby you were forced to be in a system whereby academic societies and course reps were one in the same. So you had academic representative societies, which is essentially the system, particularly in Finland and a few of the others, but all of the Scandinavian and the Baltic countries and the Nordics, they all tend to follow this kind of system. That was fascinating, and some of the hallmarks of it. And so I present this as a challenge. So imagine all of the things I'm about to say became how your union worked. What would you do in response? So what would you have to learn? What would the pros be? Where would the risks be? So that sort of stuff. So think about it through that lens. So I've chosen 2 universities from the tours. One is Aalto University, which is probably quite similar in both profile and layout to maybe Loughborough University here. That's in Finland, Aalto. AALTO in terms of people who want to Google it, Aalto University. And the other one is Kaunas University, which is in Lithuania. There we go. So they form 2 parts of what I'm going to talk about briefly. So in both of these, they combine, academic societies combine representing students and coordinating student reps in terms of careers, social events, student welcome weeks, and any kind of partnering peer mentors, buddy schemes, as well as having concern for the pedagogy in their subject. So on both sides of the fence, you'll recognise them as the objectives for both societies and of course rep sort of development. They have a special relationship with the Central Students' Union. I should say that all these have it essentially whereby representation is devolved. So it's much more the faculty union or the faculty association supported and coordinated by the Central Students' Union. And that's slightly different from the way we do it. It might be similar in the Oxbridge ones, I suppose, but and in Durham, but it kind of different at the same time. Nevertheless, so the big academic societies, they are big is the first thing. Combine those kind of careers, social events, and pedagogy, but also they're supported by the Central Union, which becomes sort of like a funder and coordinator. So it incentivizes particular behaviors. So if you wanted to, a program around sustainability, for example, a pot might be put up by the Central Union, and then that incentivizes the school societies to behave in that way, sustainably, one might say. But and you add that, convert that to any program. With Aalto, I kind of was going to talk briefly about the Aalto Economic Society because it's good to pick an example. And they talk about networking with company representatives on career nights and company visits, as well as the other things. And one of the things I found quite common in these institutions is where basically the co-curricular side of the course reps, you have to start talking about it this way. So the course reps group make a society, and then as opposed to just the extracurricular society stuff, which is probably the fun things, then you have curricular stuff, which is the pedagogy stuff, which in my opinion is still fun, and the quality assurance and stuff. In the middle, somewhere in this hazy middle ground, is co-curricular stuff. And so what is increasingly common, obviously within the business societies, but within others, and where I think there's space for me to explore in London Met, is in this co-curricular space, is students curating their own careers fairs. So students of a discipline reaching out to employers would be one version of looking at it, but also the sector in which their discipline exists to pull about essentially student-led careers fairs for them to broker the relationships with an organization or a particular speaker. In some of these ways, it's not too different from the way societies work, but bringing them in and having quite LSE do this, that's cool. So that sort of stuff, and it's quite common across all the schools, and the central unions help support all the societies to do that, so it becomes a kind of standard. But the blending with student voice is quite important, because where does it stop in terms of representation? And so for that, I'm going to go over to Kaunas University, where essentially what happens is you have fewer SABs go into all the university committees. This bloom in societies that are devolved representation means you have potentially many more volunteers at a kind of academic governance level. So the union doesn't just send all of its sabbaticals to 150 million meetings. They look at volunteer opportunities for people from those societies to then apply or use democracy, whatever method you want to use, to sit at university, central university level committees. And in order to sort of manage the quality of that, a really interesting thing that Kaunas do, and that is going up into Tallinn University as well, which I mentioned in Estonia, and even the people in the Scandinavian universities are looking at this, is they introduced the representation test, which is essentially you have to pass a test in order to be able to sit on a university committee. And the test is challenging, but the objective of the test isn't to class people out. It's weirdly just a way of going, we need people to know X amount about the way the university works before they can sit and represent all students. So it's kind of an interesting, it's a tasty difference, and it's something that the academic societies thing enables by the fact that there's a larger amount of people participating in representative activities, if you want to call it that way. And so they balance it by doing this development track that's about, does every representative know what the faculty names are? Does every representative know what a periodic review is? Does every representative know how the elections work of the Students' Union? It's those kind of like, imagine some hygiene factors, and it's a question I would challenge you if you were to design such a test.
And how do they get them to know that stuff?
They do like webinars and stuff like that, and they teach it. People can fail the test a few times, so you can do it like a driving test, fail it until you learn. None of it's really impossible. We looked over it. It's quite intense in the one in Kaunas, and even the other universities across the other countries are going, well, that's a bit heavy, but we want a version of that. We see what it's trying to achieve, and we want to achieve that. But Kaunas is like it's an hour-long test. Who is the vice chancellor? What does the pro vice chancellor learn and teacher do? It's things like that. And also, interestingly, and this is flipping it over, I know this isn't the scope, but to advice, what happens if you plagiarize? What's the rules on plagiarism? What's the rules on X, Y, Z? So it's also a regulatory test as well. And what you find is, within these very volunteer-led cultures of student unions, because of the split into academic societies, it enables more people to be working at that level. And you end up with a weird situation where out of 10,000 students, 600 of them know all the academic regs in and out. And so advocacy happens much more locally, supported by the central union, but there's a kind of much wider awareness of rights. And it's an odd sort of like, it's a cool knock-on effect of the kind of massification of those academic societies, in the sense that, once again, you basically got more reps. It's just they've all got a different mission in mind. Some of them are more into quality assurance. Some of them are more into social bridging activities. Some of them are into intramural sport, and some of them are into careers and that kind of stuff. That's really bluntly it.
Yeah.
So my question would always be, and when I'm talking to my team, if we were forced to have that system whereby we woke up one day and, oh wow, actually, there's a universal approach to academic societies, so everyone is entitled and is automatically a member of an academic society, and we've abolished the course rep system and merged it into the academic society system. What does the rep coordinator need to know how to do? Mm-hmm. What does the society coordinator now need to know how to do? What's great about that and what's risky about it? Yeah. What does it mean for central representation? I just think that the questioning these things and imagining is the best way of looking at it.
Because some questions, it's like we've planned this, Alan. Those questions that you've just posed are what we're going to try and talk through a little bit now. So in terms of what does the kind of student ops side need to know, and what does the rep side need to know, that segues us lovely onto Rhys and Jack. So for them, they've kind of started thinking about this already, but I think, things might have moved on since I had a conversation with Rhys about this a few months ago, but from where, what I thought, and the reason that I've brought Rhys and Jack into this conversation is because they haven't necessarily done this at Notts Trent yet, so they haven't merged academic societies with representation structures, but Rhys is on the ops side and Jack's on the representation side, and you've been doing a lot of thinking about it. So I'll stop talking now. You tell us where your thinking's got to.
Okay. So yeah, we've been thinking about this together for about a year or so, just over a year now. I mean, my thoughts around this have started probably before that, but when me and Jack actually started seriously talking about it, it was about a year ago. We've spent the last year mapping out what that might look like, answering some of those questions that Alan posed before. What do we need to know about each other's roles? What would the students need to know? What does the academics need to know? Like, what are all the questions, and what are some of those potential answers? And trying to talk to as many people as we could within Nottingham, Trent, whether that's students, academics, and various other key stakeholders within that kind of area. I think Jack can talk a little bit more into depth about what we actually did, but to give you an overview, I guess, we're hoping to run a trial of this new system that we've created starting next year. We had an email from the head of the faculty, I think it is, this morning, just kind of checking in to see how we are with that. So fingers crossed that we are still able to do that trial in September. With the current situation that we have, obviously there's been some big question marks as to whether or not we'd have to put it off for a year. But fingers crossed we are still able to do that trial run with the school that we want to do it with.
Which school are you doing it with as a trial?
So we're doing it with Social Sciences was the school that we chose, just because for us at Trent it gave us the biggest range of issues. I guess it has the biggest course in that group. It also has some of the smaller courses and some courses that are just a bit weird. So thinking more about education specifically. So I did education in my postgrad, and you spend a lot of time on placement. You're not actually on campus a lot, as well as having those kind of extra responsibilities outside of your studies of teaching, I suppose. So it's how does this model work with those students as well as working with those more traditional, I come in, I do a lectures, I do a seminar, I go home, that a lot of other subjects have. So we chose social sciences because it gave us that range of issues, and if what we're trialing works with all of those different scenarios, there isn't really a reason why it shouldn't work with the rest of the university going forward. But I'll let Jack talk a little bit more about the details of what I've just said.
Yes. So to give it context, as I imagine many of you were, me and Rhys had been discussing this for a while, and it finally sort of came really came to the front of the imagination. Membership services last year in Manchester. And I think the background for all of this, and there's a few people in the chat saying that they have started working on this or they've been implementing it. And I hope a lot of people agree with us. The call for us wasn't about nibbling at the edges and making tiny changes. It's about taking the system, unplugging it, renovating it, not just reinventing the wheel, really changing it for the better, and then putting it back in. And we'll discuss a little bit more about that in a minute. But the important thing that we found as well so far is at any moment we can step away from what we're doing, we can take it away, and we've still got strong representation structures, and we've still got strong academic societies, because ultimately we don't want to really fiddle with this, ruin it beyond repair, and then the students have got none of our core purposes. So yeah, that's just a bit more of the background. But the actual implementation, we've been working consistently with our student groups, both as reps, course reps and school reps at Trent. We've been sat down with a lot of the societies. And again, not to tread on Rhys's toes too much, but at Trent, we've got some really old societies that we thought would be quite problematic and really not liking the idea of changing. And it's quite surprising how open to change some of these, what we'll call traditional societies were. And something that we always kept in mind for that is, and I can admit this back when I was a student not too long ago, students often can be apprehensive to change because they like it and they've heard from alumni and the years above them how it is. But what's key to remember is students, for the most part, are only with the university 3 or 4 years and then they're gone. So it's not about getting hung up on what students necessarily want now. It's about making sure that they're beneficial and can develop in the years to come, 5, 6, 7 down the line. And then the other side of that, obviously, is taking what we've taken from the students, trying to remain as student-led as possible, to speak with course committees and school forums and all those really exciting meetings that occur at the university side, talking to the deans and to actually get them on board and making sure that what we're proposing is actually working for them as well. And I won't go into it too much now because I know people have been asking questions about communication. But one of the key features for us was all about simplifying it, because I'm sure many of you will have realised that university staff don't always understand the structures of the union and they don't always follow through on how communication works. So we wanted to give one-stop shops for the head of psychology to contact the relevant people without having to dot about between different groups. And if you don't,
Oh, we're losing Jack a little bit there.
Yeah. Just to finish off what you were saying,
Yeah.
we were trying to make it as simple as possible for students and staff to navigate through representation and academic societies within the issue. That was one of the big things we wanted to achieve, because we looked at what is the difference between an academic rep and an academic society in terms of what it wants to achieve, and fundamentally they're very, very similar aims that they want to get, just slightly different ways of getting there. So it's about trying to find a more cohesive method of achieving what we want to achieve with those groups, I guess.
Yeah, really good point. Okay, well, we'll get to some of your Q&A questions in a minute, because I think they are linked to a couple of the bits that I'd like to cover anyway, so that's great. So the next thing I wanted to ask about are, like, what are the so for Jack and Rhys, what have you found are the opportunities that will come out of this? And Alan, what do you think were like the good parts of this? What are our like reasons for doing this? And Rhys, you just touched on one there around like making the communication simpler between your academics and your students, but what else is good about doing this?
I think one of the other things that we found is that because societies has a very kind of structured nature to it, like that's a thing, it has a preconceived idea about what that is, what does that mean, how does it work, and for the most part societies run very similarly around the country. We decided that we were going to call them academic communities just so that it had a different name, so that those groups could be tailored to fit the students that are within them. So one of the groups we met with was our law society, Lex, and they don't necessarily like the idea of elections for their committees. They would much rather have them as like appointments, so where the students are interviewed and are kind of appointed into their roles based on qualities and skills that they have that they bring to those roles. And that's something they could never have as a society. But it's something they could have potentially under this new system if that's what everyone agrees is the best thing for those students. We've also looked at trying to potentially tackle issues that various different groups have. So again, using that law example, the BAME community is massively underrepresented in law as a subject area, and looking at women in the hard sciences and stuff like that. So tasking these groups to be built in a way that try to tackle those issues as well. Each group could be built differently, basically, is what I'm trying to say, because they're not following a predefined structure of a rep system or a society system. They're all built uniquely for those students, with those kind of subject areas and career paths in mind, I guess. So that was one of the other opportunities. I think it's a really good thing. There's
a really good opportunity around like customizing based on what that course needs, rather than trying to fit into the structures of the SU that already exist.
Yeah, definitely.
Alan, what do you think in terms of like what are the good things about doing this?
So from talking to the elected officers at some of these unions quite intensively, some of the advantages seem to be around the ability to see, it's a flip of what Rhys is saying, really. Most of the stuff we do is we externalize the mechanics of our own unions, and although they are our shop fronts, when really a student's just a student and wants to do things, and that's their experience. I mean, it's a big, nebulous, messy experience, but it's from their point of view, it's one thing, one engagement. And what they meant was, it meant that they were able to tackle wider problems across the institution in a more flexible way. And that ranges from problems people have with their courses to also opportunities. So you're able to harness the kind of partnership narrative that's big in the UK. It kind of like really embraces that partnership approach to the entire faculty culture, if you want to use an Americanism. Like you get this kind of like ability to be quite very localized, to have local solutions to local problems. I'm starting to sound like a kind of election pitch, but it means it localizes it a little bit more and recognizes that fine arts students are going to have a different scope on life than an engineering student will do, or a nursing student, and whether that means elections or not. I mean, it's a classic. If we were having a conversation about a course reps conference now, we'd be going around in circles about the benefits or otherwise of elected course reps, of the word representative and all that sort of stuff. So I think it's able to sort of park some of those questions a little to an extent and sort of go, it doesn't really, to some extent, it doesn't matter as long as you've got a critical mass of people talking about their experience in the way that's relevant to where they are. I also think from a student union point of view, it means that they're able to have more participants, so they make more leaders, and they are able to rise to the challenge of what does quality of representation look like in a kind of more, very few times do you get a chance to say it this way, in a massified way. So they can look at like a quality assurance structure that's different. They can look at it different because they can't train every rep now, because reps no longer sort of exist. Reps are now sort of everywhere. So maybe there's a type of training program that's like train the trainer. So mainly they're trying to teach people to teach each other. There's a lot more peer sort of delivering stuff, and the union's able to take a kind of quality role in that.
Yeah,
which means it's more capacity for representation.
Okay.
And just it looks more fun. There you go. There's the other way of putting it.
It looks more fun.
It just looks a bit more fun and a bit more lively, to be honest.
So why haven't we always done it like this? Jack, what do you think?
So why haven't we always done it like this? So quite interesting. Me and Rhys were chatting with our deputy CEO, who's been in the SU circuit for a long time, and it was one of the big things that appealed to him about us changing the idea was actually most unions and universities have had a very similar representation model for coming up to 20 years now. There's not been dramatic changes. So I think there's definitely an aspect of why haven't we done it like this? Well, we've always been a little bit scared to change it. We've been a little bit scared to go wrong. And I think that's definitely my experiences both at Trent and when I was a student. And I think the other more probably pressing reason of why haven't we done it like this is because we're very used to a one-size-fits-all method. For the most part, a rep in the humanities is very similar to a rep in the sciences. It's very easy for us to deliver it as a service, and it's very easy for the university to react to it because they work across the board on it. By doing this, yes, we're trying to take away the one-size-fits-all and standardise it. Take away the standardisation. Let individual courses and their committees and their societies run on their own. But by putting everybody into one group, it keeps the simplicity that staff seem to like. And I know that was quite a bit of a way around saying quite a simple thing, but I think that it does go back to the idea we're just not used to changing the system. And it's not truly broken. It's not a terrible system at all, but there's definite room for improvement. And that's what we've found speaking to absolutely everybody so far.
I've got a bit of an answer for it as well, if that's okay.
Yeah.
In the sense that, and I agree with Jack, it's the system we've got isn't necessarily a bad system. It's just, you could make an argument, this is channeling Mike Day, who's the historian of the student movement, that essentially, this is the way we've done it forever, but it's modelled on a smaller student body. So, designed by committee, you can see each of these structures fit fewer students, and then the more students you get in the system, the more distant you are from the people you're trying to represent, and the more distant you are from the more diverse and disparate those experiences are. So it's not as homogenous anymore, and that's a good thing. So the system, I guess, just doesn't fit, that we've got doesn't necessarily fit who we are now. But it's also worth saying that this system isn't a panacea either. It has its own problems. You can imagine with a vast diversity of voices, the kind of challenges that they get are around, well, two different competing arguments at the same time on the same issue, all that sort of stuff, which you can see in any devolved system now. Think about the states of the United States of America argue against each other all the time. Think about the Scottish question in the UK. Like, there are different positions. When you devolve, you also devolve authority and you devolve people's opinions, and that's so that there's tension on that side as well.
Before we move on as well, actually, because it kind of links back to that, and it also links to what somebody was just putting in the chat. I believe it was Abian, I was also a TSD student, so it's always good to speak to one of your own. So the idea behind that as well, and why haven't we always done this? To talk about something so current, I think if there's one lesson that I've learned, and actually a lot of people speaking to have learned during the virus outbreak, is what is representation? Who do we trust and why do we trust them? because I know I speak for myself and many other people, that in the daily government briefings, people have a very different reaction to when they hear elected MPs speak and to when they hear medical professionals speak. And the idea of having elected versus interviewed and appointed is, we're hoping that students realise these are people that are trusted, these are people that have experience and the relevant, even life experience to go forward with it. Whereas I know we've spoke to people in the past and they're massive concern with elections, and we know it's very true from course rep right through to sabbatical. There is times where it is favouritism, best dressed, who fits well. And I know the University of Sheffield very recently did, Sheffield SU did a piece of work around BME students and their representation in elections. So again, it's about tackling different bridges. And why haven't we done it before? Just because it's not done. It's new, it's exciting, and it's scary.
It's hopefully a bit less scary after this conversation. And it sounds like a few people who are commenting in the chat have already started doing some of this. So please keep sharing what's working and what's not working so well. And we'll open up to kind of further questions and discussion in a minute. So we've talked a little bit about some of the things that I wanted to pick up initially. So what I'm going to do now is just close the screen share so that we can see each other and see all of the questions. So we'll start tackling some of those questions now. It's worth saying that none of us are experts on this. We just think it's interesting. So if anybody who has experienced it, I think Derby SU said and Lancaster SU have said some stuff that's quite interesting. So keep sharing those in the chat. One of the questions that I wanted to get through was about what do you three think in terms of challenges for part-time reps? So the example they gave was a medical student president who is in placement 9 to 5, and then the meetings for academic board, for example, are in the daytime usually, because this stuff happens in the day. What do we do about that?
Can I have a pop if you want? So one of the things from the models, particularly in in all of the Baltics and the Nordic countries, they all have a minimum requirement for representation on the university governing bodies, and it's about a third of any. I think it's a third. Don't quote me too much. It's about a third. It's something as ridiculous as a third, which is brilliant. Of anyone on any body, governing body, academic board, course rep committee, whatever it is, has to be students, and so that's by law. And so they handle that way. But what I would say is, if we consider this a question of localization, essentially, then with the medical students, then that means that school itself will be forced to ask itself whether that's the right time to have a board. It would have to start flexing that around the needs of the participants in those meetings, the voices that need to access. The same way a union would, if you want to have council or a trustee board that you want to engage your councillors in, or whatever bodies you've got, you wouldn't automatically put it at the most inconvenient time for anyone you flex and make. And so the implication is that by localizing these kind of problems in this way and having more reps, that the schools would have to sort of change the way they do their engagement with students.
Yeah, good answer there. Another question, Polly from Heriot Watt SU has said, I think this is probably for Rhys and Jack. So with your academic communities model, do you give them a bare minimum structure for what they need, or is it 100% flexible? So are there like bones to the skeleton that you ask for?
I think we've approached it very much like, here's your academic society and here's your rep system. Here are the elements we have to keep. So we have to keep the representation element, and we have to keep kind of that social guest speaker and all that sort of stuff that societies would typically do. So we've approached it of, these are the activities that your group has to do. How do you want to facilitate them, essentially? And we do provide them with this is our best guess at what we think could work. But then we give it to them to edit, I suppose, and come up with their own kind of customization on, I suppose, as you say, a skeleton or a bare bones. But there's nothing that's not up for discussion, I guess. Like, I think if someone could make the argument that that they don't need to have socials as a group, then and if they make a good enough argument, then we'll consider it. You know what I mean? So, yeah, I think we do provide them with a bare bones, but it's up to them to decide how much they want of that, I guess, and what they want to keep.
I think the key, Rhys, I think the clearest way of doing that, the best sort of real-world example, is our executive structure for them. So we went with the idea that there would still be an overarching executive made up of a president, a secretary, and at least one other role. So that's still very familiar to the society's kind of aspect. But then they can add roles if they need. So as Rhys was alluding to earlier, if it's such as the law with its BAME underrepresentation, well then they can have a BAME officer on there to be at the forefront. They can go to the school forums, campus committees and such and discuss, really take that BAME aspect forward. And then underneath that, as a sort of subcommittee, is where all of the reps sit. So they can work with the executive. They've still got overarching view, but it also means we've got some societies that are some courses that are about 800 students a year. They're really beefy courses like psychology. And it means that there's the person power to actually carry out what they're doing. So if they're putting on a speaker or a social, they've got all those reps there and they're not feeling like there's a 4-person team to take the lead.
Yeah. So we've mentioned a few times about auto-enrolment, and there's been a bit of discussion about this in the chat. So let's talk about auto-enrolment for a second. So one of the, I'd be really interested to hear from those in the chat that have done this already. So I think Huddersfield have mentioned that they've done it, and that you auto-enroll every student into their academic society. So a couple of things, either for the chat to answer or for Jack, Rhys, Alan, your thoughts on around auto-enrollment. What do you do about charging membership fees? And if you don't charge membership fees, then how do you fund stuff to happen? And what happens if it's auto-enrollment and then a student says they don't want to be part of that group, that community anymore? Therefore, what do we do about their voice being represented with their academic school?
I think the way that we approached it was that we wanted auto-enrollment. We wanted the university to subsidise that. We also wanted to allow students to join other academic communities that weren't the one that they were auto-enrolled in as well. It might more so be for the social element of it rather than necessarily the representation side, but we wanted them to still have that choice of joining any group that they wanted. They would just then have to pay out of their own pocket that contribution that the university would have paid for every other student in that group. So that was quite important for us, so that no one was kept out of any groups that they felt that they wanted to be a part of. It's an interesting question around what do you do around students that don't want to be a part of it. I think, so far we've approached it with the idea that if you don't want to engage with it, you don't have to. You're auto-enrolled from coming to the university, but if you don't want to attend any of the sessions, then you don't have to have that. I don't know if we've given any thought to the idea of I actively don't want to be associated with this group, but I still want the representation that it offers me. I don't know if we've come up necessarily with a solution to that, other than maybe if we met with those people, maybe it's more of like the VPs, that the office of trustees representing them directly rather than it going through the system, if that was appropriate. I don't know. It's something we've not necessarily come up with a solution that would work, particularly if there were a lot of people that felt like that.
In your model, the academic department is paying for the activities of the community associated with their department, and then but students can then pay a few pounds, I assume, if they're a history student but they want to join the law society with the law community, then they can pay.
Yeah, definitely. And we still have funding pots in place for various types of activities. So our activities grant, for example, is for a lot of activities that societies typically would do. So these academic communities will still have access to those pots of funding from the SU side, as well as that funding from memberships that would come from the university side that they would have got normally from getting members to join. So in theory, everything should still relatively remain the same in terms of funding, but the student will see that they don't have to go out of their way to join a group. They're just automatically a part of it. Which should reduce the students that say they don't know about things, whether they do or don't know about those things. I don't know. So
there's a good follow-up question to this from, sorry, I didn't mean to Jack. There's a good follow-up around engagement in an auto from Amy. Engagement, and how do you measure engagement? And I think that from looking at the work of the other unions, obviously it becomes less about membership because memberships are given. So it becomes about the quality of activity. And actually from the Central Student Union's point of view, it becomes about the achievement of outcomes. So where Rhys was talking about grant funding that's available to societies, those central unions tend to act like a kind of a charitable funding organisation that needs to spend money in order to achieve a certain set of outcomes. So they put bids up so the societies can bid for amounts, that kind of translation. But it becomes much more about outcomes, I think. And also, you know, there's an accountability in the system that actually if some of those KPIs, if we use the dangerous word satisfaction in this, if the members of an academic society are not satisfied with the work of that academic society, then what kind of recourse is available to those students to change that? And I think the way they seem to address it is by ensuring that there's scope to deliver a variety of activities and sort of suit a range of interests, if that makes any sense. So these societies do become truly big when they get going.
Yeah. Oh, so many juicy questions.
Literally. Oh God, Rosie.
I'm going to move us on to another question that I think is really important. So I know that not everybody who's participating in this is from a university or an HE setting. And I think this is a really interesting opportunity for colleges where there's less capacity for supporting representation activities and, for want of a better word, organised fun. And the society's kind of social side. What do you all think? Alan, was there anything did you look at just universities when you went on your Scandinavian tour? Or was there any?
We weren't just universities. The equivalent of one or two of them were HE and FE, I suppose, is the way you describe like some of the ones we saw. And they tended to be smaller institutions with less funding available. And so that it answers some of the kind of the scope for what we're talking about. And whereas they found it was, the system was centrally not as big as you can imagine, the kind of the fuel that they put into it, but it answered their needs. It was scalable. It meant that they could look at groups of students basically making decisions about both how they felt about their course and what they should do for the social that week or what charity. I mean, it's quite, they make basically small student unions is probably the way it looks. It looks much more, bijou is not the word to use, but it looks like a small student union that goes, right, cool, because we observed like a kind of a meeting of this, and it was supported. I'm not saying it wasn't an FE out and out, but it felt like there was a smaller, it was a small and specialist, and the same kind of conversations that would have happened when I was on an exec in Liverpool Hope, when we were just all volunteer led, was that like we all made the decisions about what's right and what's wrong about the institution at the moment, what club night, what have we got DJing next week, what charity we fundraise for, and how the sports teams, like that kind of range of things, and who's going to NUS for that thing. Like it was, and they feel like that a bit more holistic. So in some respects, I think they could work better and more easily within FE because it just allows, I don't know, there's a bit more flexibility in scope of the conversations that probably matches what students would expect to be able to talk about and do.
Yeah. We're going to have to wrap up in a minute. How fast does time fly when you're having fun? I want to pick up one more question, and then I'm going to drop in the chat is a link to Coffee Shop Table 2. So we're going to be in Coffee Shop Table 2. So for Rhys, Alan and Jack, if you have time and would like to join in that chat, then please do. But also everybody else, if you want to carry on talking about this and you haven't got another session to go to or a meeting or something, go to Table 2. I've dropped a link in the chat. So one more question that I'd appreciate all of your thoughts on is, what do we do if we've got students who are more on the kind of social side and they're more bothered about that and really don't want to get involved in the representation side, or vice versa? They're really into the rep side and just don't want to organise socials. What are you thinking about that, Rhys and Jack, with yours? Because obviously it's going to be a new thing for your students. Have you thought about how you'll do that?
Yeah, so Jack alluded to this earlier, that we have a two-tiered committee structure, which has, like the traditional society element and then more of the representation side. So students can be a rep and be in that exec committee if they want to be in both, or they can be in either side and be responsible for whichever side of that conversation that they actually have a preference. So whether that's more the fun socially side, and that's the sort of committee roles that they potentially want to go for, or if they just want to be a rep, they can run to just be a rep and they'll only be responsible for being a rep. Equally, they still get a say on some of the other things that happen within the academic community, and they get consulted on what do you think about this, but they don't necessarily have that same level of responsibility that, say, the treasurer is going to have for trying to find the funding to deal with whatever it is that the group have decided to do. We wanted to keep that so that students, because there are a lot of students that do like both, so we've built a system where they can do both, but then equally they can do one or the other, and that's equally as fine. So we've tried to take that into consideration when we've put this together, and most of the students that we spoke to so far have liked that they have that choice, particularly if one year they think, oh, I just want to be a rep, and then actually I see what it means to be a president or a treasurer, for example, and maybe the year after I want to get more involved in that side of things. Maybe I'll swap, or maybe I'll add that to my responsibilities and also be a rep at the same time. So the flexibility is there to students to choose how little or how much they want to be involved.
Okay. Well, we're gonna wrap up there because I want to give everybody time to have a little break before the next session. I'm dropping in the chat a link to the blog that we referenced at the start. So Alan noted down some thoughts ages ago, and I've been meaning to put this up for ages, and doing this session has meant that we've put it up. And what I'll do is I can turn on comments on that blog. So if anybody has any thoughts or reflections or experiences that you've had in your student union or your team that you want to add to that. And I think that this is, let's talk about this some more at another time because it's really interesting. There's absolutely loads of good ideas that have been dropped in the chat. So I've got those and I'll put them somewhere too afterwards. But yeah, so thank you, Alan. Thank you, Rhys. Thank you, Jack. And thanks everybody for participating. Let us know what you thought. If you want to chat on social media, it's #StudentOpsFest. And have a good day, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank